instrumentation.
You mentioned accreditation standards. Is CBI accredited?
Yes, it is.
And what is required for accreditation?
To be an accredited laboratory, you need to undergo annual audits or assessments to show that you follow the accreditation standards that are set forth in the field of forensics.
And who is in charge of the accreditation process for labs throughout the United States?
CBI is currently qualified or accredited by the ANAB, which stands for the ANSI National Accreditation Board.
And are there FBI quality assurance standards as well?
Yes. In the DNA laboratory, we do follow additional standards that are known as the FBI Quality Assurance Standards for DNA testing laboratories.
How long have you been doing this type of work, Ms. Miller?
I've been in forensic DNA since 2002, so a little over 18 years now.
I'm going to ask you to walk the jury through your education, if you would, please.
Sure. I have a Bachelor of Science in Biochemistry from the University of Missouri, as well as a Master of Science in Biological Sciences from the University of Denver.
And your professional experience, please?
Yes, I have been at the current laboratory I've been at for about a month now, and then I was with the CBI lab for about 14 years. Prior to that, I was a contract employee with the U.S. Department of Defense at the Armed Forces DNA Identification Lab since 2002. So that's when my forensic DNA career started.
Currently, what professional affiliations do you hold?
I am currently a member of the AAFS, which stands for the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. I'm also a current member of ASCLD, which stands for the American Society of Crime Lab Directors. And I'm also currently certified by the American Board of Criminalistics in molecular biology.
Have you ever had any of your work published?
Yes, I have.
Tell us about that, please.
I have been published once from my master's thesis was published, and then again I was published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences. I was published twice in the Journal of Biological Chemistry, once in Nature Genetics, and once in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences.
What is the National Academy of Sciences?
The National Academy of Sciences is a group of individuals that reviews and has literature to do all sorts of science research. And so I was part of a research project back in my previous lab work days that was published.
Have you been qualified as an expert witness previously?
Yes, I have.
In what?
I've been qualified usually in the fields of DNA and forensic serology testing and interpretation.
Where have you been qualified by the courts as an expert in those areas?
In those areas, I have been qualified in multiple district courts throughout Colorado, to include, for example, Adams County, Arapahoe County, Weld County, Larimer County, Boulder County, Jefferson County, Eagle County, as well as La Plata County.
Approximately how many times, Ms. Miller?
I don't keep track anymore, but approximately 75 times I've been qualified as a witness.
Your Honor, at this time, people would move to qualify Sarah Miller as an expert in forensic serology and DNA analysis.
No objection.
Should be so qualified.
Thank you. Ms. Miller, I'm going to move fairly quickly through some of the foundation questions around serology and DNA, because the jury's already heard from a witness that's covered some of those areas, okay?
Okay.
But I do want to bring your attention first to an area that I'd like you to discuss with the jury, which is regarding the weight required for DNA analysis. So let's say a swab is used to take a buckle from me, rub through my cheek. How much DNA would you want to see for a DNA analysis to be conducted on this swab?
Typically, we would see a very large amount of DNA from a sample like that because it's coming directly from the mouth. We would see many nanograms of DNA, and we would actually dilute that DNA down for our testing because we need much less than we would obtain from that type of a sample.
Right. So can you explain that a little bit? Why do you dilute it down to get it to a certain weight range for your testing?
Our testing is pretty specific for what we do, so we want to make sure that we don't overload the sample with too much DNA, and we try to get as much DNA as possible for maybe some lower DNA amounts that we may have. So we kind of have this range of what we like to target the DNA concentration to be in our testing.
You mentioned the taking of a buccal swab from the inner part of one's cheek is a really rich area for DNA.
Yes.
That's an area that is used to conduct buccal swabs all the time.
Yes, we use them for standards all the time.
Is it fair to say that when you take a buccal swab, if you did one on me right now, you wouldn't take it out of my mouth and weigh 3 pounds or 5 pounds or 7 pounds, right?
That's correct.
And I see you smiling. It would be nanograms.
Yes.
And then you dilute it down to what for testing purposes?
We target typically about half a nanogram or so, half a nanogram to 1 nanogram for a good quality DNA profile.
You also use DNA that can be weighed in picograms.
Yes.
And how does that come about?
Well, a picogram is a billionth of a gram, so it's much less amount of DNA that may be present. So we can obtain DNA from the picogram amount.
And do you see that in the laboratory setting often?
Yes, we do.
And is that consistent with the accreditation standards that you've talked to the jury about?
Yes.
Thank you. Is it fair to say DNA technology has changed over the years?
Yes, it has.
So when you and I started this work years ago, let's go with you, it's 18 years ago, right?
Yes.
How has DNA analysis changed over the years?
Well, DNA analysis is a science. And so just as any science, you know, as technology progresses and we learn more and we get more knowledge on a particular topic, it does change, and we try to make the technology better as the years progress. So since I started that, I know CBI has been through quite an evolution of technology changes in the DNA section.
So 20 years ago or so, let's say you had a swab from a sex assault case. What kind of technology and DNA analysis was being used by CBI?
It would have been the same, overall, the same type of technology. We were doing the same type of typing back then. However, we used a different chemistry back 20 years ago. So it was a chemistry known as profiler plus cofiler. It's just a kit that we use to create the DNA profile. So that particular chemistry is what has changed throughout the years.
And with all DNA, you're looking at cellular material, so very small.
Yes.
Back then, using that kit, how many locations would you look for DNA analysis?
With our original kit that I just mentioned, we would look at 13 locations on the DNA that is forensically relevant.
How about 10 years ago?
10 years ago, we moved to another chemistry that was known as Identifiler Plus that perhaps you heard about earlier, but Identifiler Plus was another chemistry that we did, but it includes the areas of DNA that we tested for. So we actually looked at 15 locations using that kit on the DNA.
How about today at CBI?
So as of 2017, CBI moved to another kit that was even expanded more. So that particular kit looked at 24 locations on the DNA for comparisons.
And has any of the software you've used during your time at CBI changed over those years to assist analysts in interpreting DNA results?
Yes, some of the software has changed. We use 2 types of software when we create our DNA profiles. One is called GeneMapper IDX. That's just a software that takes the raw data off of the instrument and makes it into a readable profile for us. So that's what we look at when we examine the items of the DNA profiles. It looks like peaks on a graph. That is what GeneMapper does for us. In addition to that, we have another new software at CBI called StarMix or STRMix. That particular program helps the analysts actually interpret DNA profiles.
So it sounds as though DNA analysis has become much more sensitive over the years in the ability to identify DNA in different locations.
Yes, that's correct.
So 30 years ago, if I gave Mr. Champagne a hug, you wouldn't be able to find DNA.
30 years ago, probably not, no.
And from now, you'd be hopeful that if the swab was taken properly and the hug was close enough, long enough, perhaps some sweating since June day, so on and so forth, you might be able to get a DNA profile from that.
Yes, that's correct.
But you might not.
But you might not, that's correct.
What are the factors that would go into whether you could get my DNA off of Mr. Champagne's coat after the hug?
Well, you sort of mentioned it yourself. So the amount of time, the amount of pressure you might use in that hug, And just people sometimes leave more DNA behind than others. So, you know, if I rub my jacket, there's a potential that I could leave my DNA behind on it, or it might be so little or none there at all that I may not even detect it.
How does touch DNA, such as in the hug example, compare to DNA from blood, semen, or saliva?
Well, blood, semen, and saliva are very rich sources of DNA typically if we have a large amount of that, same as the buccal swab that he mentioned earlier. So that is more of a rich source, whereas a touch DNA sample, such as a hug or me leaving, you know, touch cellular material behind, is not quite as much DNA present. However, it's still usually enough depending on how much cellular material you leave behind.
You mentioned StarMix. What was your experience, what was your role at CBI when StarMix came online?
So as the DNA technical leader, it was my responsibility to ensure that this program was properly validated within our laboratory and that it was properly tested for use at the laboratory, as well as making sure that all of the DNA analysts that use that software are properly trained and qualified to use it correctly.
Can you walk us through your training and experience with StarMix, please?
Sure. Our training began in 2017, where the developers of the software, they're actually a New Zealand government laboratory that helped develop the software. They came out and trained all of our DNA analysts for 4 days, and we had a very extensive 4-day training with them to learn about, you know, the underlying math that the program uses, as well as how to report it and testify to it in court. So we had that 4-day training. In addition, we had another full day of training, more as a refresher course. We had to read lots of published literature on the software and go through other training documentations. And then every analyst at the CBI lab then had to, including myself, had to take a competency test. This is when we took samples that we created in-house, so we knew what the answer was. We had to run it through the program ourselves and make sure that we got the correct answer in order to show that we were competent to use that software.
And were validation studies engaged in with regards to StarMix?
Yes. When we bring on any sort of new technology, we have to undergo internal validation studies to show that it works properly in your laboratory.
How does CBI utilize StarMix when it comes to DNA analysis?
So StarMix comes at the very end of the interpretation process. So the creating the DNA profile, all of that thing until we get the actual profile, that's the same. That's been the same for many years now. StarMix comes in after that, and we feed it that information of that DNA profile, and StarMix can then what we call deconvolute that DNA profile into either a single contributor, or sometimes there's multiple contributors in a sample. It can deconvolute that sample and then provide a statistical analysis to show the weight of that particular DNA evidence.
So how would you describe the effect of StarMix on DNA analysis to a layperson? What does it do?
StarMix it's a very sophisticated program, but it uses math and statistical algorithms, and it takes what we know about what a DNA does within your body and how it acts with our DNA profiles. It takes all that information and performs its algorithms to deconvolute the sample for our interpretation. But again, it's just a tool that the analysts use. We still have to make sure that the information that it gives us is still intuitive to us, because we're the experts and we have a certain expectation of what those results should be based on how we interpret DNA profiles. So we make sure that the software is intuitive with our expectations.
On a practical level, how do you do that? For example, let's say you get a case and you go through the process. At what point in the process do you use StarMix, and for what purpose?
We use StarMix to help us with the interpretation, especially when we have complicated mixtures. When we have mixtures of more than one individual, sometimes the interpretation can be really complex, because you may have, somebody may leave a lot of DNA in a sample, somebody may leave just a little bit of DNA in a sample, and sometimes it's hard for the DNA analyst to interpret that fully. So that's just an assistance with that piece. And then, as with any DNA sample that we can compare to a known sample, we want to see, does this evidence sample perhaps match a known person, or is that known person possibly included as a person in this evidence DNA sample? So we use StarMix to create that statistical analysis to help show us the weight of that and whether or not somebody is included or excluded from a sample.
So it's particularly useful when it comes to understanding and analyzing mixtures.
Yes, it's particularly useful for mixtures.
So Mr. Champagne and I hug. Mr. Bogan says, have a good weekend, pats him on the back. Investigator Heidel sneezes on the back of Mr. Champagne, and now you have mixtures.
There's a potential for a very complex mixture there, yes.
How does that show up in the laboratory?
A mixture is going to look to the analyst as more than two peaks. So as you know, you get DNA from your mother and your father. Because of that, at each location that we look at in the DNA profile, you can only have a maximum of two peaks. One peak coming from your mom, one peak coming from your dad. When we have a sample at a particular location that has 3 peaks, 4 peaks, 8 peaks, that's how we determine how many numbers of contributors or people might be in that particular mixture. So it's based on the number of peaks that we see and their respective peak heights.
When you see multiple peaks, do you always know the exact number of contributors?
No, we do not. These are our evidence samples, so we never know the true answer to who may be or may not be in a mixture sample. But we are trained examiners, and we use certain procedures to determine that number of contributors to the best of our ability.
So how do you determine the number of contributors to the best of your ability? What do you do?
Well, the first step is going to be to count the peaks. So at each location that we look at the maximum count at that particular location. So some locations may only have 2 peaks, some might have 4 peaks, but you look for that maximum number. So let's say, for example, you have one location where you have 6 peaks that are showing at that location. We then divide that by 2 because one person can have 2. So we divide that 6 by 2, and that gives us 3, and that's our minimum number of contributors that would be in that sample, because based on the number of peaks, the maximum that we see at a location, that would give us an indication that there are at least 3 individuals present in that mixture. There could be 4, but it wouldn't make sense for there to be less than that.
I believe you said global filer is what's used currently for CBI's DNA analysis?
Yes, that is the chemistry they use, yes.
How does StarMix work with or in conjunction with global filer?
Well, global filer creates the DNA profile, so that's the chemistry that actually creates the profile. It looks at those 24 locations that we examine. We then take that information and feed that into StarMix for it to do its computation.
When did StarMix come online for CBI?
In fall of 2018.
And how long has StarMix been used, to your knowledge?
Overall?
Generally, yes.
In general, it began in Australia and New Zealand in 2012. It started first in the United States in 2014 with the U.S. Army Crime Lab. I believe the FBI started using it in 2015.
CBI started using it when?
2018.
To your knowledge, what other laboratories besides CBI use StarMix currently?
Within Colorado, there are 2 other labs that also use StarMix, the Jefferson County Crime Lab as well as the Unified Metro Crime Lab in Douglas County. Additionally, it is used, I believe, of last count, 65 laboratories throughout the U.S. It's also used worldwide. It's used in Canada, in the UK, in China, in Europe, and other countries that I can't remember. Worldwide.
How does CBI confirm that StarMix is working properly? You touched on this earlier, but I'd love to have you just close out the loop and explain how the analyst can determine that StarMix is providing the information in conjunction with the DNA analysis.
Well, it's kind of a 2-step process. So as part of the analysis that StarMix does is it gives some diagnostics. These diagnostics tell us whether or not the expectation of the analysis works properly. So these diagnostics tell you, okay, did it fit the expectation that we have for running the software? This is all based on. My apologies. For the software and its output. So additionally, besides these diagnostics that it has, it's kind of like in your car. You know, you can see how much gas you have, you can see your fuel level. It kind of gives you an idea of how your car is running. Same sort of idea. Additionally, again, we are the DNA experts, and so we have an expectation of what that output should be. You know, does it make sense what it is telling us as far as potential contributors in that mixture? Does it make sense with what we expect to see? And that is part of our analysis.
And as CBI continued to maintain its accreditation that you talked about earlier, with StarMix coming online and through the use of StarMix since 2018.
Yes.
And as part of that accreditation includes the DNA analysis, quant values, serological analysis, StarMix, and so on.
Yes, all of that.
At some point, did you become involved in the investigation and prosecution of Mark Redwine?
Yes.
How did you first become involved in this case, Ms. Miller?
I became involved because it was the beginning of getting StarMix online, and it was brought to my attention that this particular case and the samples that were part of it might benefit from the use of StarMix.
How so?
Well, StarMix is a software that really helps with some complex mixtures. And in this particular case, because there were related individuals involved, mixtures get even more complex. This is because relatives share DNA. And so especially really closely related relatives, they share that DNA. So those mixtures get really complicated when we have mixtures of related individuals. And so we thought that using StarMix would really help us with some of those mixture profiles.
Do family members share the exact same DNA?
No, they share a different combination of the same DNA.
About identical twins?
Identical twins do, yes.
Other than identical twins, family members don't share the exact same DNA.
That's correct, but they do share some DNA, but it's in a different combination.
So familial DNA, what does familial DNA mean when I use that phrase?
Familial DNA is usually when we'll look at profiles to see whether or not somebody may be related.
And as you said, when it's family relationships, they're closer or more complicated because of how many things they have in common.
Yes.
Were you aware that DNA analysis had been conducted previously in this case?
Yes.
And who was that conducted by?
I believe the original analysis was conducted by Becky Strub.
So is StarMix a new process for developing a DNA profile or a different way of interpreting DNA profiles that have been developed?
It's a different way of interpreting the DNA profiles that have already been developed.
And the use of StarMix in the Redwine case, was that the first time you used StarMix?
In a criminal case, yes, it was.
Have you gone back and looked at your results since then?
Yes.
Have you also used StarMix in other cases since then?
Yes, we have.
Tell us about those, please.
Yes, we've been using StarMix since 2018, so the majority of casework put out by the CBI Laboratories that needs it uses StarMix.
Approximately how many cases has CBI used StarMix on since 2018?
Hundreds, if not thousands.
What was the goal in using StarMix in this particular case?
The goal, again, was to look at these complex mixtures of related individuals because the previous analysis that Becky Strub did used a different statistical method than what we were currently using or we're going to be using.
I'd like you to take us through a number of the tests that you ran using StarMix in regards to this case, if you could.
Okay.
You recall working on item number 1 in this case?
Yes, I believe it was 1.1, CBI item number 1.1.
Thank you. And what was CBI item 1.1, if you recall?
I can refer to my report.
Commissioner of the Court? Thanks, Sarah.
Item 1.1 was swabs of the couch east cushion.
What analysis was conducted with regards to StarMix on that sample?
We performed an additional analysis using the new global filer chemistry on that sample, and then we ran it through StarMix. And with that, I determined that it was a mixture of 3 individuals, based again on those peak heights that were present in that mixture. The DNA typing results for that particular mixture were at least 11 quintillion times more likely if they originated from Mark Redwine and 2 unknown individuals than if they originated from 3 individuals that are unknown.
And who at that point in the testing, so we're going to talk about this further as well, at that point in the testing, who was excluded as contributors to that particular sample?
In that particular sample testing, I did exclude Elaine Redwine, David Stone, Corey Redwine, and Dylan Redwine as potential contributors to that DNA profile as a mixture of 3.
And that's, sorry, that last point you made was actually my next question. You ran that as a mixture of how many people?
Of 3 people. As part of the StarMix process, the analyst has to tell it how many contributors are in that mixture. So based on the peaks that I saw there and that maximum count, I determined that it was a mixture of 3 individuals for that analysis. So that's what I told StarMix it was.
How, if at all, were those results different from what Rebecca Strub had produced previously in this case?
Well, this new testing did provide more information because it was an updated kit that looked at more locations on the DNA, so it was a little bit more information in this testing, but it also gave a different statistic than Ms. Strub had performed previously.
How so?
Well, Ms. Strub talked about, her analysis was based on a combined probability of inclusion statistic, whereas StarMix gives a likelihood ratio statistic.
So has the terminology used by CBI and the analysis used by CBI changed over the years?
Yes, the statistic we report has changed.
How so?
We previously reported a random match probability for single source samples. We reported the combined probability of inclusion or exclusion for mixed profiles. So those kind of statistics were looking more at the rarity or probability of selecting an unrelated person from the population randomly to fit into that mixture. A likelihood ratio is a different statistical analysis, and it can be described essentially as it's a fraction of 2 competing hypotheses. So on the top of your fraction, or the ratio, is often referred to as the prosecution hypothesis, that a particular person of interest DNA is present within a DNA sample. On the bottom of that fraction is often referred to as the defense hypothesis. This is usually that a person of interest DNA is not present on that sample, and instead it's a random person that we don't know. So this likelihood ratio then weighs the probability of observing that evidence if this proposition versus this proposition. Now, because it's a fraction, you look at it at the totality of that likelihood ratio value. If it is greater than 1, that means that your top hypothesis has greater support. So there is therefore greater support that a person of interest is included in a DNA profile. If that likelihood ratio is less than 1, then that means your bottom hypothesis has greater support. So there's greater support that a random individual contributed to that DNA profile as opposed to the person of interest that you compare.
Just to back up a step, when Ms. Strub did the analysis, was CBI then using Global Filer?
No, not when she did her analysis.
So what did Global Filer provide to you that Ms. Strub didn't have available to her when she conducted the first wave of analysis in this case?
Her analysis, again, looked at 15 locations, whereas Global Filer looked at 24. So it did provide more information in the Global Filer analysis.
And that interpretation looks at the number of peaks, I believe you said?
Yes.
And how does that analysis of the peaks, how is that impacted when it's different members of the same family?
Again, this is where it gets a little complex because we do share DNA. We don't share the entire profile that we look at, but we do share certain locations with our close family members. So when there's a mixture of, say, me and my mother, I'm going to share half of her DNA. And so therefore, the peaks are going to look like maybe only 1 peak, even though both of us contributed to that because I shared that peak with my mother because she gave it to me. Does that make sense? So
I don't think they can answer
Yes,
you.
I'm sorry.
But they have an opportunity to ask questions later. So at some point you produced the results from StarMix, am I right?
Yes.
And at some point thereafter, CBI asked to look at StarMix again, assuming one person's in the mix. So
Yes.
Can you tell the jury about that, please?
Yes, as part of the StarMix analysis, we do have the benefit of being able to assume a contributor to a sample. We would do this when we have a great expectation of somebody's DNA to be present, whether it's a sample taken directly from their body, we would expect their DNA to be present, or if it's something from their home, for example. So we were asked to do an additional analysis, assuming Mark Redwine's DNA on that sample because it came directly from his home. In being able to assume a person's DNA, because it's reasonable to do so, it kind of gives StarMix more information to do its analysis. You're kind of giving it a head start, if you will.
And who made that request of CBI?
The defense made that request of us.
And the CBI offer both the prosecution and the defense the opportunity to request testing in cases?
Yes, we actually have it on our report that we will look at other additional testing scenarios if it is reasonable to the case, and so to contact us.
So the defense asked you to assume Mark Redwine was in the mix.
Yes.
What was the result of the StarMix test that was conducted by CBI at that point?
I didn't actually do that testing.
So did Teresa Cheromcha conduct that testing?
Yes. Yes, she did.
And did you review the testing?
Yes, I did.
Is Ms. Cheromcha here to testify after you today?
Yes, she is.
Thank you. Item number 2 in this case was not a mixture, if you recall.
Yes.
Do you recall what it was?
I do not off the top of my head.
Assuming if item number 2 had been analyzed by Ms. Strub as a full DNA profile belonging to Dylan Redwine, would you use StarMix at that point?
No, we would not.
What's the reason for that?
Well, the statistic for a single source essentially wouldn't change for that type of sample. So we looked at only the complex mixtures in this case for the additional analysis.
Since the single source profile of Dylan Redwine from item 2 was not a mixture, you moved on to item 3.
Yes, that's correct.
Tell us about your analysis of item 3 using StarMix, please.
Item 3, which was the swabs of the floor under the rug and coffee table, indicated a mixture of 2 contributors. These results for item 3.1 were at least 1.9 quintillion times more likely if they originated from Corey Redwine than if they originated, Corey Redwine and an unknown individual rather than 2 unknown individuals. That was very strong support for the proposition that Corey was a contributor to that profile.
Can I stop you for
Yes.
a second? I'm sorry. Very strong support. Is that a new phrase or term that CBI uses in DNA analysis?
Yes, it is. We use a verbal scale to convey these likelihood ratio numbers, because sometimes we might have a really small number and sometimes we might have a really huge number. The verbal scale helps to give context to that number. Is it really small? Is it really large? Because the average person doesn't have a feel necessarily for how big these numbers can be. So we use that verbal scale to help explain the context of that likelihood ratio.
And in terms of the numeric value assigned by StarMix, Corey Redwine is 1.9 quintillion times more likely to be present in the sample.
The evidence is 1.9 quintillion times more likely to be observed if it originated from Corey Redwine and an unknown individual.
That, just to make it a little easier, hopefully, that's 10 to what power?
The 18th.
What'd you do next on item 3?
I then compared Dylan Redwine's profile to that, and those typing results were at least 1.6 sextillion times more likely to be observed if it originated from Dylan Redwine and an unknown than if it originated from 2 unknown samples. That, again, was very strong support.
Thank you. And 10 to what power for that one?
Sextillion is 10 to the 21st power.
Based on those 2 results, what'd you do next in StarMix?
So because I had an individual inclusion of both Corey and Dylan into that mixture, I then did another analysis where I looked at both of them together. Do their DNA profiles make sense together in that mixture? So in doing that, that evidence profile was at least 490 tridecillion times more likely if it originated from both Corey and Dylan than if it originated from two unknown, unrelated individuals. Again, that was very strong support for that proposition.
The proposition that it's both Corey Redwine and Dylan Redwine as the two contributors to that mixture.
Yes.
Let me interrupt you because we're going to have to fix this for the record. What was that number? Because I heard of all the other ones. I've never heard of that one.
490 tridecillion.
You want to, can you spell that for us?
It's Tredecillion.
10 to what power?
42.
What does that mean in layperson terms?
That's kind of why we use the verbal scale. Anything over 1 million, any likelihood ratio over 1 million, we consider to be very strong support for that proposition of a particular individual being a contributor to a profile.
And here, not just over 1 million, but we have 490 tridecillion.
Yes.
Who is excluded as potential contributors to that DNA profile based on your analysis?
Elaine Redwine, David Stone, Mark Redwine are all excluded as potential contributors to that mixture.
So let's turn to the next mixture in the case, item 5.1. Can you walk us through that, please?
Yes, that was the swabs from the floor in front of the love seat, item 5.1. That indicated a mixture of 3 contributors. So based on that analysis, those typing results were at least 400 times more likely if it originated from Mark Redwine and 2 unknown individuals rather than 3 unknown individuals. That was considered moderate support for the proposition that Mark Redwine was a contributor to that profile.
So 400 times more likely, so far less than 1 million.
Yes.
And that's moderate support.
Yes.
So what do you do next in the analysis, Ms. Miller?
Then I compared Corey Redwine's DNA profile, and those typing results were at least 72 quadrillion times more likely if they originated from Corey Redwine and 2 unknown individuals rather than if they originated from 3 unknown individuals. That was considered very strong support for the proposition that Corey Redwine was a contributor to that DNA profile.
You then look at Dylan Redwine as a possible contributor to that mixture.
Yes, I did.
Tell the jury about that, please.
Yes, that evidence was at least 80 quintillion times more likely if it originated from Dylan Redwine and 2 unknown individuals rather than it originated from 3 unknown individuals. Again, that was very strong support for that proposition that Dylan Redwine was a contributor to that DNA profile.
And the 3 of them are family members to your knowledge and based on your DNA analysis, right?
Yes.
So what do you do next to figure out who's in that mixture in 5.1?
So in that particular mixture, because I had an inclusion for all 3 members, I then ran StarMix a 4th time to see whether or not they can all 3 be present in that mixture together as a 3-person mixture that would consist of those 3 individuals. Those typing results were at least 60 duodecillion times more likely if they originated from Corey Redwine, Dylan Redwine, and an unknown, unrelated individual rather than 3 unknown, unrelated individuals.
Spell decillion for us.
Decillion. Duodecillion, excuse me.
Oh.
Duodecillion.
And that's 10 to what power?
The 39th power.
So what does that mean, that result?
So in that particular result, Mark Redwine couldn't be present in that mixture if Corey and Dylan were also present in that mixture. The peaks that were present didn't make sense for them all 3 to be included together. So when I did the original analysis and I did include Mark Redwine as a contributor with a lower likelihood ratio value, that could have possibly been more of a a weaker indication of that mixture because of the shared DNA that was present within that mixture. So I actually reported that even though it is very strong support that Corey and Dylan are present in that mixture, they were not all present together. So Mark Redwine was not present in that mixture if it consisted of Corey and Dylan.
So if the mixture was consistent with Corey and Dylan, which you had at, or StarMix had at 60 duo decillion,
Yes,
and Mark Redwine could not be, or would be excluded.
right, yes.
How do the family DNA connections there factor into the StarMix analysis?
Well, again, they share DNA, so it just takes into account looking at each individual person in that mixture. So in this particular mixture, there was DNA present that didn't match all three of them. So it had to be an additional person that wasn't present, or I didn't have a sample to test for. So there was additional information there that wasn't consistent with those three together.
Meaning someone else?
Yes.
Okay. So let's go back to the hug of Mr. Champagne. It's Friday and I'm just feeling good about it. Hug Mr. Champagne, Mr. Bogan pats him on the back, Investigator Heidel sneezes on him. You're able to break down the mixture, and then there was also an unknown profile. What does that mean to a layperson?
It means that we don't have a way to compare that unknown profile, that it's somebody else that could have left DNA due to another reason. So his wife may have left DNA on there, but because we didn't have her sample to compare it to, we'll never know. It's considered an unknown person.
So his wife, the dry cleaner,
Exactly, yes.
someone at the security at the front door, just someone else who's not known out of the group that you're looking at.
Yes.
And the ones you're looking at in this sample, 5.1, it's that 60 duodecillion number, more likely that Dylan Redwine and Corey Redwine are contributors to this mixture of three.
Yes, the evidence is more likely to be observed if it is a mixture of Corey and Dylan.
Let's turn to the next mixture, item 6.1, please.
Yes.
Can you walk us through that, Ms. Miller?
Yes, that was the swabs of the coffee table, and that indicated a mixture of two contributors. That evidence was at least 560 septillion times more likely if it originated from Mark Redwine and an unknown, unrelated individual than if it originated from two unknown, unrelated individuals. That was very strong support for the proposition that Mark was a contributor to that profile. Additionally, the evidence for that item was at least 54 quintillion times more likely to be observed if it originated from Dylan Redwine and an unknown, unrelated individual than if it originated from two unknown, unrelated individuals. That also was very strong support for that proposition that Dylan Redwine was a contributor to that DNA profile. Lastly, again, because I had both of them included in that mixture, I ran another test to see if they could be in it together. And those typing results were at least 500 quattuordecillion, that is spelled Quattuordecillion, 500 quattuordecillion times more likely to be observed if it originated from both Mark and Dylan Redwine than if it originated from two unknown individuals. That also was very strong support for the proposition that they were both included.
Who were excluded as potential contributors to that DNA profile at item 6.1, the coffee table?
Elaine Redwine, David Stone, and Corey Redwine were all excluded as contributors to that mixture profile.
When you're looking at mixtures, am I correct, or sorry, when you're looking at mixtures, it's not possible to tell how the DNA was left behind, right?
That's correct.
So the hug, the pat on the back, the sneeze, you're not able to break out what the source was or when it was left.
No, I cannot.
But you can analyze who's contributing to that mixture.
Yes.
And that's where you get that mixture of Mark Redwine and Dylan Redwine, at least 500 quattuordecillion times more likely if it originated from those two individuals.
Yes.
And you mentioned Ms. Cheromcha also performed DNA work on this case using StarMix. Is that right?
Yes.
And you had an opportunity to review her work?
Yes.
And did you agree with her findings?
Yes, I did.
Your Honor, I have nothing further from Ms. Miller. Ma'am, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. Mr. Bogan?
Thank you.
I want to revisit the topic of StarMix with you, Ms. Miller, and if you can't hear me or if I'm mumbling my words, please let me or the judge know. As you said on direct, StarMix, relatively speaking, is a new system for CBI and other labs to analyze mixtures, correct?
It's a newer software, yes.
Right. And I think you said it's been online with CBI since about 2017 in the fall, is that correct?
2018.
2018, I'm sorry. And because it was new technology, new software from New Zealand, it was subject to validation reports by Colorado Bureau of Investigation, correct?
Correct.
And you talked about that on direct.
Yes.
And that's because CBI and you want to make sure that this system, this software is on point and helping you all in your analysis of mixtures, right?
Yes, we want to make sure it works properly in our laboratory.
And when we're talking about analyzing mixtures with StarMix, the procedure is first, the analyst has to estimate the number of contributors, correct?
Yes.
And you talked about that on direct.
Yes.
And what you do is you look at what we call in the field the E-grams, right?
Yes.
And just to revisit that, as you said, how many different loci, locations on the DNA molecule are you looking at on Global Filer?
We're looking at 24 different locations. 21 of those we actually use in StarMix.
Okay. And how many of those actually have the 2 peaks for a normal known sample?
Well, everybody gives 2 peaks to a sample. However, sometimes they might give the same peak. So, for example, if your mother gave you a 15 and your father also gave you a 15, that's going to show up as a single peak. So you have the opportunity to show either 1 peak or 2 peaks per individual.
So what you do with a mixture is you look at these different locations on the DNA molecule, right?
Yes.
And those are rendered on an E-gram where you can see these peaks, right?
Yes.
And there's like the peaks and then the location of the peak, right?
Yes.
And all the location of the peaks are given kind of convoluted names, right?
Yes.
And this isn't right, but it could be anything from like DXW235, right?
Yes, they're usually named after the chromosome that they're located on your DNA.
And you look at these different locations, which in the field you call loci, right?
Yes.
Multiple locations, loci, right?
Yes.
And you look at a specific location and you look and see how many peaks are there, right?
Yes.
And barring if there's 2 identical twins, 2 peaks means 1 person at that location on the DNA molecule, right?
Potentially. It could also mean 2 people. If one person is only providing 1 peak and you have another one, it could be 2 people or more.
And that would get into dropout and stochastic stuff that I don't think people want to hear on Friday afternoon. But
we can get complicated, yes.
But if you go to a specific location on the DNA molecule and there's more than 2 peaks, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, then at that point, the analyst has to try and estimate the number of contributors to that particular part of the molecule, right?
Yes.
And typically, as you described on direct, your analysis is count the number of peaks, divide by 2, and that's your minimum, right?
Yes, there's a little bit more that goes into that as well, but that's the main part of the analysis.
So when using StarMix, first you look at the E-grams, estimate the number of contributors, correct?
Correct.
And then that data, the number of contributors, number of estimated contributors, that data goes into the StarMix, I want to call it a machine. What should I?
The program.
Goes into the StarMix program, right?
Yes.
And that first initial information, number of contributors, goes into the StarMix program without information about known profiles, right?
That's correct.
And one of the things the StarMix program does is it looks at the number of contributors and then does that statistical analysis of the actual DNA, right?
Yes, it breaks down the mixture depending on how many contributors you tell it. So it will break down the potential contributors to that mixture.
And in breaking down that mixture, it'll break it down in form of what percentages different contributors are contributing to that mixture.
Yes, it will estimate the proportion for each contributor into that mixture.
For example, suppose you got a mixture with 4 people, and it seems pretty obvious from looking at the E-grams and the peaks. You look at it and you're like, look, this mixture here looks like it's 4 people. It's probably Doherty, Heidel, Champagne, and Bogan, but we're not there yet. So you look at it and you enter that into the StarMix program, 4 known contributors or estimated contributors, correct?
Yes, estimated.
Okay. And then what StarMix will do is it'll analyze the actual stuff on Mr. Champagne's jacket, and it'll say contributor 1 contributed 65% to this, contributor 2 contributed 25%, contributor 3 contributed 15%, and contributor 4 contributed 5%.
Yes, typically adding up to 100%. I didn't do your math.
And I started doing math while I was talking, but that's, and you get that report, right?
Yes, that's part of the report that StarMix gives us.
And then after you get that report, then you can add information from the known profiles, correct?
That's when we do the comparison to determine that likelihood ratio statistic. We then compare those profiles.
Right. And safe to say, the percentages get presented to the analyst on the deconvolution report, right?
Yes.
And then you actually do the actual analysis to see if the known samples are part of that mixture, right?
Yes.
And then you get a report from StarMix about that, right?
Yes.
And that's on the LR report, correct?
LR meaning likelihood ratio.
Right. So going back to our hypothetical, we got a mix of 4 people on or around Mr. Champagne's jacket. And those percentages, I'm going to break them down better math this time. 25, 25, 35, and 15. Then you would enter in my known profile, Mr. Heidel's known profile, Mr. Champagne's known profile, and Mr. Doherty's profile, correct?
Yes, I can.
And then the LR report would tell you how our profiles can coincide or don't coincide with those percentages, correct?
Yes, it would align with a particular contributor via an estimation.
And this is an estimation done by StarMix.
Yes.
And StarMix, I think you would agree, at CBI right now is state-of-the-art DNA analysis today.
Yes, I would consider it.
Okay. And the report you did on October 3rd, 2018, when this was your first StarMix in a criminal case, yes?
It was, yes.
And you analyzed a number of known profiles, correct?
Yes.
And if it helps you to refresh your recollection by looking at your report, let me know. But one of the known profiles was Mark Redwine, right?
Yes.
And that was denoted on your report as his profile being item 9.1, correct?
That's correct.
And you also had a known profile from Mr. Corey Redwine. He was item 10.1, correct?
Correct.
And you also had item 13.1, that was Dylan, correct? Dylan Redwine, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Now, when you ran the analysis on item 1.1, I don't know if the people have the capability to put 340 on the screen. We'll catch up to you if you can. It's your recollection item 1.1 was the couch east cushion, correct?
Yes.
And you're aware of Becky, Ms. Strub's findings regarding that same item, correct?
Yes.
And you're aware that Ms. Strub said that neither Corey nor Dylan nor Mark Redwine could be excluded from that mix. That was one of the differences in her analysis and you in the star mix analysis, correct?
Yes, I believe that was the only difference that we had. Yes.
Right. Permission to move about them?
Yes.
I'll project. You know what?
No, let's,
I'll do my question and come back. You guys.
Mr. Bogan?
Thank you. Orient the jury, we're talking about we're talking about that cushion there on the picture, correct? Because that coincides with CBI-1, correct? Does that make sense to you? Yeah. And to revisit, there's a little break in the action there. Rebecca Strub had determined that Corey, Dylan, and Mark Redwine could not be excluded from that mixture, right?
Yes, I believe so.
And you and Star Mix came to a different conclusion, correct?
Yes.
You and Star Mix came to the conclusion that based upon the idea that it was 3 contributors, it was most likely Mark and Mr. Mark Redwine and 2 unknowns contributing to that mixture, correct?
The evidence was more likely, yes, based on a mixture consisting of 3 individuals.
Right. And the deconvolution report associated a percentage to the biggest contributor, that was contributor 1, who came out at 76%, correct?
Yes.
And contributor 2 came out at 21%?
Yes.
And contributor 3 was at 3%?
Yes.
And you know from the LR reports that contributor 1 was 9.1, Mr. Mark Redwine?
Yes.
So the best science Colorado Bureau of Investigation had to offer in 2018 said the mixture on CBI-1 was 3 people, Corey and Dylan could be excluded, and it was 76% Mark Redwine, correct?
Yes. Estimated to be.
Right, and that's kind of how Star Mix works. It's making these estimations, but they're estimations that you rely on as an analyst in the mathematical conclusions you come to.
Yes, we use them in our interpretation.
Right, and your interpretation includes all those really, really, really big numbers you've been talking about all day.
Yes.
I want to turn your attention to CBI number 3. What's your recollection of what CBI number 3 is based upon your October 2018 report?
Swabs of the floor under the rug and coffee table.
Okay, and that's denoted on People's 340 by this text box and that arrow, correct?
Yes.
And refresh the jury what your findings were regarding that mixture.
That indicated a mixture of 2 contributors, and that evidence was at least 490 tradecillion times more likely if it originated from both Corey Redwine and Dylan Redwine, rather than if it originated from 2 unknown, unrelated individuals.
And there was a deconvolution report for that item as well, correct?
Yes.
And that deconvolution report said that contributor 1 estimated contributed 54% to that mixture, correct?
I don't know exactly, but I can refer to my notes if you'd like.
I got your notes back here too, so whichever's fastest for you.
Okay.
And I can approach with the deconvolution report and the LR.
Yeah.
May the record reflect I'm showing you page 1 of deconvolution.
Yeah.
And page 1 of the LR report.
Yes.
You good? And StarMix state-of-the-art technology said contributor 1 contributed how much to this mixture?
Approximately 54%.
And StarMix state-of-the-art estimator told you how much contributor 2 contributed to this mix?
Approximately 46%.
And then the report from the LR, and you may need to look at your report, coincided contributor 1 at 54% with Mr. Corey Redwine, correct?
That's correct.
And associated 46%, the smaller number, with Dylan Redwine, correct?
That's correct.
Turning your attention to CBI number 5, you probably got it on your report, but I'll ask you to bear with me, everyone. What item is that based upon your report?
The swabs from the floor in front of the love seat.
Safe to say that's, according to People's 340, this text box and that arrow, correct?
Yes.
And what was yours and StarMix's estimations and conclusions as to item 5.1?
The overall conclusion was that the evidence was at least 60 duodecillion times more likely if it originated from both Corey and Dylan Redwine, as well as an additional unknown person, than if it originated from 3 unknown persons.
So safe to say when we're talking about item 5.1, you using the StarMix program came to the hypothesis or conclusion or opinion that there's 3 contributors there, correct?
Yes, I determined that it was indicated that there was a mixture of 3.
Okay. And those 3 contributors were Mr. Corey Redwine, Dylan Redwine, and an unknown.
That was the statistic. It was at least 60 duodecillion times more likely to observe that if that was the case. And
the LR report regarding that assigns statistics to each one of those 3 contributors as well. Statistical estimates?
Yes, if you compare them individually, yes. And that's what I mentioned earlier.
Right. And contributor 1 was determined to have contributed 63%, contributor 2, 36%, and contributor 3, 1%, correct?
That sounds right.
Do you want to look at the report to make sure we're on point here?
I trust that.
I mean, thank you. So we got on item 5, 63, 36, and 1%, correct?
Yes.
And the LR report you got from StarMix associated Corey with the 63%, correct? Contributor number 1.
If I can see that one.
By all
yes.
means.
I believe that's true, but.
May the record reflect I'm showing you the entirety of the deconvolution report, page 1 of the LR report.
Yes, that's correct. So
Corey is associated with the 63%, correct?
Yes,
And Dylan is associated with the 36%, right?
yes,
And the 1% is associated with an unknown profile.
yes.
Item 6.1, that's the swab from the coffee table, correct?
Yes.
And what were your conclusions as to item 6.1, swab from the corner of the coffee table?
The overall conclusion was that that evidence was at least 500 quattuordecillion times more likely to be observed if it originated from both Mark Redwine and Dylan Redwine, rather than if it originated from two unknown, unrelated individuals.
And so we got two contributors, correct?
Yes, it was indicated too.
With very strong support for Dylan Redwine and Mr. Mark Redwine, correct?
Yes.
And do you recall the percentages that were assigned to the contributors?
I do not. 60.
The record reflects presenting the witness page 1 of deconvolution report. They're both deconvolution report, my apologies. Page 1 of the deconvolution report. Contributor 1 to that mixture, estimated by StarMix, state-of-the-art program at CBI, says 84%, correct?
Yes.
And the contribution of contributor 2 was 16%, correct?
Yes.
And StarMix, via its LR report, associated Mr. Mark Redwine with the 84%, correct?
Yes.
And Dylan Redwine with the 16%, correct?
Correct.
You've testified on direct about how DNA analysis and software has evolved and changed, and probably from your opinion, gotten better over the years, correct?
Yes.
And what was you mentioned two kind of parallel systems here in StarMix. What was in play in 2012, if you recall? Because it wasn't StarMix, right?
No, we did a manual interpretation. So the analysts would interpret the DNA profiles fully themselves and then perform statistical analysis on those results.
And when StarMix came online in fall of 2018, it made analysis of mixtures change quite a bit.
Yes, it was an additional tool that we could use as analysts to analyze these mixtures.
And one thing StarMix doesn't provide analysts with is information about when that sample got deposited, where it got deposited, correct?
That's correct.
And one thing StarMix does not do is inform the analyst or anyone who of the contributors is contributing blood to any particular sample, correct?
That's correct.
All I can say is, based upon this number of contributors, this is the estimated percentage of contribution based upon known profiles, probably their percentage of contribution, correct?
Yes.
And likewise, when the analysis was done with StarMix in 2018, a new series of quantifications were run as well, correct?
I don't recall. I didn't do that analysis myself, so I don't recall.
Okay, you didn't run the quants on these?
No, I did not.
Okay. Then I don't think I have any more questions for this witness.
Redirect.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ms. Miller, I know we were going to deal with a lot of this with Ms. Cheromcha, and that you were trying to catch a flight. Cheromcha, yes. I know you're trying to catch a flight, but I'm going to have to follow up on some of the questions, okay?
Sure.
So item 3 or 3.1, you had testified that it's at least 490 tridecillion, 10 to the 42 power, times more likely if it originated from Corey Redwine and Dylan Redwine.
Yes, that the evidence was at least 490 tridecillion times more likely if it originated from them.
May I approach the screen?
Yes.
Now? And that's this area here, CBI 3, the floor under the rug, under the coffee table. And that was the area that Rebecca Strubbick found Dylan and Corey Redwine could not be excluded.
Yes.
And what was the effect of having star mix to analyze these results?
The overall conclusion remained the same, that they were both still included in that mixture, just the statistics changed.
And counsel started to get into percentages with you.
Yes.
Can we back up a step and explain to the jury, please, just to clarify, what are those percentages?
Those are approximations of the proportion of that contributor's DNA to that sample.
And what does that mean in terms of the source of the sample, if anything?
It can't tell us anything about the source. It just kind of tells us how much more or less somebody may have contributed to that sample, but it doesn't tell us that that person's contribution came from a particular body fluid or cellular material.
So it doesn't tell you whether it's blood, semen, saliva, or touch?
No, it does not.
Item 2, you testified you did not look at with star mix because that's a single source profile.
Beyond the
correct.
scope of cross. I didn't ask any questions about 2.
Well, don't go any further on that then. That's correct.
Yes, Sean. Thank you. Item 5, and I'm going to step back.
Yes.
You testified with regards to item 5, that it's at least 60 duodecillion times more likely if it originated from Corey Redwine and Dylan Redwine.
Respectfully, Judge, object. This sounds a lot more like direct than redirect. These have all been asked and answered.
Hasn't this already come out?
And I'm following up on the questions that counsel asked about the proportion percentages.
All right, then do it.
Yes.
Thank you. The proportion percentages in star mix for 5.1 shows Corey at 63% and Dylan at 36%. Can you explain to the jury, what does that actually mean in practical terms?
In practical terms, it means that proportionally, Corey would have given more DNA to that sample than Dylan did if they were contributors to that mixture.
And when you say give more, can you explain how that works in terms of DNA analysis and star mix?
Can you repeat that?
Sure. You just said it means Corey Redwine's DNA profile or DNA's contribution was greater, there was more, than Dylan Redwine.
Yes.
What does that mean?
Yes, it means that it was detected in our analysis that he provided more DNA than Dylan would have if they are contributors to that mixture, based on the proportion and the peaks that are present in that electropherogram or egram.
And based on your analysis, does it appear that Dylan Redwine and Corey Redwine are both contributors to that mixture?
Yes, I do believe they're both included in that mixture.
With regards to 6.1, testified on cross-examination about Mark Redwine and Dylan Redwine both being contributors.
Yes.
And that Mark Redwine's DNA had a stronger percent or higher percentage than Dylan Redwine's percentage.
Yes, it was estimated that Mark left more DNA than Corey if they were contributors to that mixture.
And that's the way Star Mix works in terms of determining who's present in the mixture and who's providing more DNA.
Yes, it tries to align with that contributor order of who's providing what proportion of that mixture.
What does that mean in terms of providing more DNA? How does that happen in practical terms?
It really depends. It depends on how much DNA was there to begin with. If somebody left their DNA a year ago and then somebody deposited their DNA on top of that more recent, there might be more DNA from the more recent deposit than the older one that had been sitting there for a year, because DNA does degrade over time. That's one example of that. Another example is just one leaves more DNA than the other, but that doesn't necessarily mean it came from a particular body fluid or cellular material. That we can't say.
And what would the impact be if someone's DNA that had been left behind was cleaned in some form or other?
Again, it depends. Typically, cleaning up a sample, you can either remove all of the DNA, you can remove part of the DNA, and it may or may not be detected.
And there are ways to tell whether something's presumptively positive for blood, am I right?
Yes.
And that's also work that's done at the CBI laboratory?
Yes.
And which was done in this case?
Yes, I believe so.
Is Star Mix able to distinguish between blood, saliva, semen, or trace DNA at all?
No, it is not.
So Star Mix is analyzing the mixtures themselves, not the sources or the form of the contribution?
Yes, only the DNA profile itself.
Miran?
Yes.
Your Honor, nothing further from Ms. Miller. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you.
Any questions from the jury? Counsel? Yeah. We just agreed. Okay, so respond to the jury. No, I'm asking the question, please. Would you expect to find trace or touch DNA on a piece of furniture, such as the sofa, that is used regularly by an individual?
Yes.
And if so, what reasons could explain the absence of DNA from that individual?
Either they didn't leave any DNA behind. If they did leave DNA behind, it may have been degraded over time, or we just may not have detected it. It could be a level that's so low that they left DNA behind, but we just didn't detect it because it was a little amount.
Anything for me to say?
Yes, Your Honor, thank you. So we've been sitting in these chairs for this week, Ms. Miller. What factors go into whether one of us is going to leave DNA on the chair?
It depends on how much is maybe exterior on your clothing, how long you've been sitting there. If somebody comes up at night and cleans the chairs due to COVID reasons, if somebody sneezed on the chair when they walked by, there's a lot of things that could affect what's on that chair.
And is it more likely that you'd find my DNA on this chair now at the end of the week than if I'd only sat in the chair once before?
Yes, the more often times you are in contact with an item of evidence, the more likely it is you may leave DNA behind on that item of evidence.
Is it fair to say that would increase the likelihood of the presence or strength of DNA being found there?
Yes.
So the more times that I'm sitting in this chair, the more likely you are to find me as a strong source of DNA being left behind.
Yeah, the longer or the more often you sit on that chair, the more of a chance it is for me to obtain your DNA on that chair.
How about, you mentioned COVID, which thankfully we're about to leave behind, but let's say every night they're coming in and cleaning this chair. What impact would that have on your ability to find my DNA on this chair?
depending on the cleaning agents that they use, if they're using something that's going to potentially kill COVID, it can also potentially destroy DNA as a strong chemical. So I would anticipate that there would be less DNA, if any, depending on when it was cleaned and how often you sat there, how much DNA you actually had on your clothing to come in contact with that chair. There are a lot of things that can come into play there.
Let's say I bleed on the chair today. They come in and clean it tonight. What impact would the cleaning have on your ability to find my DNA on this chair?
Again, it depends. With a blood stain, you're starting off with a lot more DNA material there, and so there would be, I would say, a greater potential for me to find DNA after cleaning. But again, it depends on the type of cleaning that was performed, how good of a cleaning effort it was, and how much blood was actually there.
They come in, they clean up, the blood is a rich source of DNA, so you'd still be hopeful you could find something.
There's potential you could.
Disappear from the face of the earth. And for the next week, Mr. Champagne sits in this chair. Just moves on. Sits in this chair for the whole week. What DNA do you think you find, in your expert opinion, at the end of next week?
From your blood stain that was cleaned up?
My blood stain's been cleaned up, and Mr. Champagne's been sitting in that chair for a week or 10 days.
I would say if the blood stain was cleaned up well, I wouldn't expect to find your DNA in that chair.
What would you find?
Most likely.
Actually, she is an expert, but at a certain point, these questions become speculative.
This is not a speculative question. Go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ms. Miller, what would you expect to find in your expert opinion?
I would expect to find Mr. Champagne's DNA possibly there if he sat there a long time and if he had his own DNA on his pants and was coming into contact with that chair.
How would the fat that I bled on the chair before it was cleaned impact the likelihood of DNA being found into the source?
It's a greater likelihood that I could obtain DNA from a cleaned up blood stain, but again, that doesn't necessarily mean that I could get DNA from that. If it's cleaned up well and there's not enough DNA remaining, then I wouldn't detect it in my testing.
Is that where the presumptive positive testing for blood comes in?
Yeah, presumptive testing for blood just means that blood was indicated there.
Cleaning and the time and so on has an impact on what DNA you're going to find, whether it be me, Mr. Champagne, or the percentage thereof.
Asked and answered.
Yes, no, I understand, Your Honor. I'm just thinking of my next question.
Okay, that's your questioning.
The DNA of Mr. Champagne, could that just be left by touch over the next 10 days that he's sitting in the chair?
Yes, it could.
And I have nothing further. Ms. Miller, thank you very much. Thanks for that question. Mr. Bogan?
In your answer to the question from the juror, you said a word that caught my attention. You said the DNA sample could degrade, right?
Yes.
Could you explain to the jury what degradation is when we are talking about DNA?
Excuse me, I'm sorry. Objection, Your Honor. This was actually covered during cross-examination. Counsel
No.
asked about.
During the last witness, but not this witness, and she said it in her answer to the jurors, Judge.
I thought it was the previous witness, wasn't it?
I believe it was this one, Your Honor, but it's fine if you want to.
Okay. Go ahead and answer the question if you can.
Describe what degradation is when we're talking about DNA.
And degradation of a DNA profile means that what was originally there and left behind by a person, now there is less DNA present because it degrades over time. So it kind of is broken up into smaller pieces of the DNA via, it could be, UV rays from the sun, it could be a cleaning agent, it can just be time. Over time, it is going to degrade into smaller samples of that DNA that we may not be able to detect, or we may detect less of it than what was originally deposited on that item.
And things that can contribute to degradation include simple things such as water, right?
Yes, if you wash an item, yes.
Or if you spill water on an item.
Yes, it wouldn't necessarily degrade the sample, but it could rinse the sample away.
Bacteria, heat, UV rays,
Yes.
moisture can all degrade, right?
Yes.
And that's something that an astute analyst can even see on an E-gram, right? That shows the peaks at different locations, correct?
Sometimes you can see that on the eGram if it's an extensive amount of degradation.
Right. And that's because some of the peaks on the DNA molecule are more robust than others, correct?
Yes, the larger pieces of DNA that we look at will degrade faster than the smaller pieces of DNA.
Right. And when you look at an eGram, which shows all the locations and where the peaks are, and if you read it from left to right and the peaks are getting shorter and shorter, that can be an indication of degradation.
Yes, it can.
And that's actually by CBI in their standard operating procedures referred to as the ski slope effect, right?
That's correct.
And what that can indicate to an analyst is that this particular DNA sample has been subject to sunlight, water, heat, bacteria, everything that over time breaks down DNA.
Yes.
Nothing further.
Ms. Witness, be excused.
Yes, Your Honor, please. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
Thank you. You're free to go. Good luck. Next witness.
Your Honor, the people call Teresa Cheromcha to the stand.
Right. Cheromcha, come up to the witness stand, please. And raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm under penalty of perjury the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. Have a seat.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Please state your full name, spelling your last name for the record.
My name is Teresa Cheromcha, Cheromcha.
How are you today?
Well, and yourself?
Doing well, thanks. How are you currently employed?
Currently, I'm the Assistant DNA Technical Leader for the Biological Sciences section of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. I work out of the Grand Junction Regional Facility.
What are your responsibilities on a day-to-day basis at the lab?
First, let me tell you about the Biological Sciences section. You might have heard a little bit about it already, so forgive me if I repeat. It's composed of two parts, forensic serology and forensic DNA. In serology, I screen or examine items of evidence for potential body fluids of interest, such as blood, semen, or saliva. And in DNA, I attempt to develop the genetic information associated with those samples. As Assistant DNA Technical Leader, I assist the technical leader in a lot of quality matters in relation to our section. So I help write and review policies and procedures, I develop training plans, I oversee the training of new hires, and I assist my colleagues in troubleshooting on instrumentation or interpretation or whatever help they need.
How long have you been doing this type of work?
I've been employed by CBI for just over 10 years now, and the last 4.5, I've been the Assistant DNA Technical Leader.
Can you walk the jury through your educational experience, please?
Certainly. I received my Bachelor's of Science degree in Biology and Biotechnology with a concentration in Cellular and Molecular Biology and Genetics from the Worcester Polytechnic Institute in 2004. I received my Master's of Forensic Science degree with a minor in Forensic Molecular Biology from the George Washington University in 2007.
Walk us through your work experience since then.
Upon graduation from my graduate school, I obtained a position at the Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory in Maryland. This was in the Automation, Biometrics, and Special Projects section. So my duties there regarding developing and interpreting DNA profiles was very similar to my current position. And I worked there for approximately 4 years before relocating here to Colorado.
And when you arrived in Colorado, what year was that?
2011.
When did you start working for CBI?
April 4th of 2011.
Can you walk the jury through your experience at CBI, please?
When I was first hired on in 2011, I started my training program with CBI. So all analysts, when they come into CBI, are required to undergo a rigorous training program. This includes scientific readings, hands-on laboratory exercises, observation of current analysts, and supervised casework for a minimum of 6 months. Since I had to do both serology and DNA analysis, it took about 13 months. So I was authorized for casework, I believe, in May of 2012. Oh, and then once I began doing casework, that was my everyday event. So I would obtain evidence, I would screen evidence in serology, make collections or cuttings or swabs, and then process them in DNA in an attempt to develop the DNA profile from them. I would routinely write reports, perform technical review of my colleagues' work, because everything has to be technically reviewed by a second qualified analyst, and testify in court as needed. And then 4.5 years ago, forgive my math, 2017, is when the position for Assistant DNA Technical Leader was developed, and I volunteered to do that.
What kind of trainings and continuing education programs do you go through to stay current in the field?
CBI requires all laboratory agents to obtain at least 8 hours of continuing education per year. This allows us to build and maintain upon our existing set of skills and knowledge. So I get this by going to conferences and attending workshops. A lot of it now is virtual as opposed to in person. And I also have to read a certain number of peer-reviewed literature papers just to keep on top of what's being developed and published within my field.
Have you been previously qualified as an expert in forensic serology?
Yes, I have.
And have you been previously qualified as an expert witness in DNA analysis?
Yes, I have.
In the state of Colorado?
Yes, all my testimonies to date have been in the state of Colorado.
Approximately how many times have you been qualified as an expert in forensic serology and forensic DNA analysis?
I have had the opportunity to testify in 12 jury trials. Most of those were a combination of serology and DNA, but a couple might have been just serology or one maybe just DNA, but usually it was a combination.
Your Honor, at this time I move to qualify this witness as an expert in forensic serology and DNA analysis, please.
No objection.
She'll be so qualified.
How long have you been working at the Grand Junction laboratory facility?
I've been in Grand Junction for my entire CBI career, so that's 10+ years.
What part of Colorado does that laboratory serve?
That regional facility typically covers from about Vail west and north, so kind of like the center mark of the state, north and then west. It also hooks down south. Sometimes Durango would go, or La Plata County would go to Grand Junction. Sometimes it would go to the Pueblo Regional Laboratory. And oftentimes cases would get sent around the state in order to balance the workload system. So that way they would get done more expeditiously for the customers.
Does CBI have laboratories all around the state of Colorado?
Yes, CBI currently has 4 laboratories. Our main headquarters is located in Arvada, just outside of Denver. We have a lab in Pueblo, as I mentioned, Grand Junction. And then there's a northern region facility in Greeley, and that's in partnership with some of the counties up there. It's like a joint operation with CBI to house analysts and process casework.
CBI in an accredited laboratory?
Yes, it is.
Tell the jury about the accreditation process, please.
Accreditation means a laboratory has received formal recognition that it has met or exceeded a list of standards in order to perform specific tests. So basically, are you saying what you do and doing what you say? Accreditation happens by a process called an audit, where sometimes it's an internal one, but oftentimes there's external individuals that come in and assess your laboratory to ensure that you are meeting or exceeding those particular standards that you say you are. And so they tell you you are in compliance, or perhaps this is an area that needs improvement because you are not in compliance. So it's a really nice way of maintaining quality control and ensuring that good product is being put out.
Has CBI maintained their accreditation throughout your entire time working with them?
Yes, they have.
Who's in charge of the accreditation process for laboratories throughout the United States?
I don't know if anyone's necessarily in charge. It's a voluntary process. Laboratories don't have to do this, but of course it's a good idea to hold yourselves accountable for what you are doing. But CBI is accredited by the American National Standards Institute National Accreditation Board, which is a mouthful, so they say ANAB. And it's one of the most well-known accrediting bodies in the world. It covers most of the local, state, federal, and even international laboratories that exist.
In your time at CBI, what does your work in forensic serology consist of?
In forensic serology, has consisted of examining items for biological materials or fluids of interest. So either touch or transfer DNA, trying to find where someone may have contacted something and make a collection, or possibly identify and characterize bodily fluids of interest, like the blood, semen, saliva, pretty common ones.
What do you do to determine whether something is likely blood in a submission to the laboratory?
Within the serology section, we have a number of chemical tests that are available to us. Oftentimes, they are called presumptive tests. This means that they are very sensitive for a fluid of interest, but they are not specific. It does not identify to an absolute degree. So example, for blood, we have a couple chemical tests. One is a color change that in the presence of blood turns bright pink. However, that's not specific to human blood. Dog blood will make it go positive, and some plant material too. So it's not even specific to blood. The only confirmatory test, which means this absolutely identifies this substance, is the microscopic examination for semen, because you can visualize, for semen, spermatozoa. Thank you. Because you can visually identify the characteristics that are specific to human spermatozoa.
What liquids do you use to determine whether something is presumptively positive for blood?
One of the common tests that we use at the CBI facility is the Phenol Saline test. Would you like me to spell that? Okay. I thought you might have already got it.
Can you tell us about that test, please?
Yes, it is a two-step color test where first you need to, possibly scrape or swab your fluid of interest. Perhaps it's a red-brown stain, so that kind of gives you a visual clue. Perhaps there's something else some sort of context that gives you information that you say, maybe it's not visible to my naked eye, but there could be blood here. So make a collection, moisten your swab it. Then it's a two-step chemical process. You add your first chemical, the phenolphthalein, and then you add your second chemical, which is actually just hydrogen peroxide that you can buy at Walmart. And then in the presence of heme in your hemoglobin in your blood, it will oxidize and kind of bubble up and turn hot pink. So it's pretty apparent when the pink change happens, and if it immediately turns pink, that indicates that blood may be present. We have to be careful of our words here, because as I said, it's a presumptive test. It's not absolutely blood. There are other things that could cause that reaction, and it might not even be human blood.
So when you receive a swab from a crime scene investigation that tested presumptively positive blood at the scene, you then do this test with phenolphthalein in the laboratory setting.
It depends on the time frame. Sometimes, yes, the test will be performed again. Sometimes if the test was performed in the field and it was performed with verified reagents, which means they were checked with a positive and negative control, we don't consume additional sample to perform a test that's already been done. So it just depends on when it came in, because the policy, I think, has shifted over time. And sometimes the analyst wants to confirm what was obtained in the field is consistent with what is obtained in the laboratory.
Because if it's in the field and it tests positive, that might be enough. But the analyst may determine he or she wants to confirm the test in the laboratory as well.
Correct. They could choose to repeat that test to record those results themselves for their own observations.
Have you, during the course of your career, also responded to crime scenes to assist in crime scene investigation and process?
Yes, early in my career at CBI, from about 2012 to the end of 2013, I think I volunteered to assist at crime scenes.
Are you familiar with the investigation and prosecution involving a defendant by the name of Mark Redwine?
Yes.
How did you first become involved in the case, ma'am?
I first became involved as a secondary crime scene responder. I believe you've probably heard from some of those primary responders. That's their main job. They do crime scenes. That's their bread and butter, if you will. I'm a laboratory agent. So as a secondary, I'm there to help them and assist. I'm there to be an extra pair of hands and perhaps give them some of my subject matter expertise. Whatever you need me to do, I do it. So I've been in dumpsters. I'm sorry, the question was, when did I first become involved? I believe it was in late November of 2012. CBI was requested to assist the FBI in a missing juvenile investigation.
That request for assistance come on November 28th of 2012, do you recall?
Yes, the first request came in on November 28th, that's correct.
And did you respond on November 29th to participate in assisting with the investigation?
Yes, the CBI primary responder had already gone down to here to Durango and determined that additional individuals could help get things done, basically. So he requested that myself and another fellow agent, Agent Jana Bates, respond down to La Plata County to provide assistance in a supportive role.
Now, at this point in your career, you're working in the lab, but you're going out to crime scenes on occasion just to assist.
Correct. My main duties are in the laboratory, but then as needed, I would get called out really around the state, but mostly sort of in the regions that I described earlier with that Grand Junction cover.
Can you just walk us through in your own words how that worked in this particular case at the end of November 2012?
Excuse me. I don't recall specifically, but I believe that my laboratory manager and supervisor probably would have come to me directly because I would have been working in the office that day and said, hey, we have a request for assistance. Are you available? Can you grab your crime scene bag and respond down to whatever location we need you to, in this case, La Plata County. And I would have said, yep, if I'm analyzing evidence, let me find my stopping point, close things up, secure everything, and get going. And probably figure out dog care. That would have happened.
Dog care, you said?
Yes.
All right. What information were you provided in connection with the investigation when you went to the scene?
Agent Bates and I arrived around 1 p.m. at Mr. Redwine's home. We didn't go in the home. We met Agent Clayton, now retired, outside, where he brought us up to speed on what was going on, that the FBI was leading this investigation. We were assisting them, and he asked us to facilitate the FBI's search of 2 pickup trucks that were going to be moved to a secondary location just for ease of searching, because there were a lot of people and vehicles at the residence.
CBI was present?
Yes.
FBI was present?
Yes.
Plata County Sheriff's Office?
I believe so. There were several agencies represented, and I did not meet everyone.
And what was going to be your specific role in conjunction with this search?
My specific role was to assist the FBI agent that was in charge of executing the search warrant on those 2 pickup trucks. So the FBI agent asked me, what do I do? What am I familiar with? And so since I am a biological sciences analyst, he asked me to assist him in doing the phenol saline testing in the pickup truck if we had anything to test. I also took care of the photography logs. So as the FBI, I believe it was Special Agent Leyman, Leyman, as he took photographs, he would describe to me what picture he was taking, and so I would record it for him. Because of course, you know, a week down the road, 5 years down the road, you need to know what you took pictures of, because you're not going to remember. So I took care of that and assisted in some of the searching of the vehicle, so going through the material and the contents of each vehicle.
So
Mr. Doherty, we're going to have to stop within the next 5 minutes because the juror has an appointment, so just pick a good spot.
This is actually a good spot, Your Honor.
Okay. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I will read these admonitions again. Please do not discuss this case either amongst yourselves or with anyone else during the course of the trial. Do not initiate, post, or respond to anything about this case on social media. In fairness to the parties to this lawsuit, you should keep an open mind throughout the trial. You should reach your decision only during your final deliberations. Do not permit any third person to discuss this case in your presence. If anyone attempts to do so, please report that back to me immediately. During the course of the trial, do not talk with any witnesses or with the defendant or any other lawyers of the case. Do not attempt to gather any information on your own. Do not engage in any outside reading. Do not visit any places mentioned in the case. Do not read about the case in the newspaper. Obtain information about it on radio, television, internet, social media, or other media source. Do not in any way try and learn about the case outside the courtroom. Have a good weekend. We'll see you Monday morning. Everybody rise for the jury. Same time, at 8. Start as soon after 8 as we can. Should have gotten over just for your wrist, huh? Hey, Mr. Mobley, you can step down unless you want to hang out. You can do what you want for a while. Anything before we go? No? All right.
Not from the people, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. We'll see you next week.
Do I need to speak more slowly for you? Or is it, do I need to speak more slowly for you? No? Okay. Sure.
I know, right? It's the same process to get back in. The world is not necessarily